And Siyao, could you share your screen now?
Sure.
So we can start like a minute late or so just to give people a chance to come. This session is a little longer. It's 5 talks instead of the others, but we have 15 extra minutes, so there's a little bit of extra time. Oh.
Okay, good morning, everyone. Welcome to session 3 of ITC 2020. Our first speaker, our first session, this is the first session of the morning, and I will let the session chairs lead the session.
Hi, I'm Siyao. Let me give a brief
Siyao,
introduction.
you're muted.
Mute myself.
We can hear you, Siyao.
We can
now.
hear you.
You can or you cannot?
You're good.
My mistake, sorry, go ahead.
Okay, sorry. Oh, okay. So I only have 3 to 5 minutes. Maybe now it's already late. Okay, so hi everyone, I'm Siyao. Let me give a brief introduction. So there are a lot of talks in this section. We'll have 5 talks. And if you stare at them, you will quickly find some common thing. So the first thing to notice is that the first 3 talks about secret sharings. And the next thing to notice is the next 2 talks about codes. So that's why this section is called secret sharing and codes. Okay, we have 5 talks. I tried my best to try to group them. So eventually I get 3 collections I would like to share with you. So let me describe those collections. The first collection of the talks, to introduce a little bit about background, I need to mention in the area of secret sharing, one of the major open problems is to determine what's the optimal share size for general access structures. Even we have spent a lot of efforts, the current best constructions to share even a single bit secret, everybody needs to get exponential number of share bits. Is this exponential number bits necessary? Unfortunately, we don't know. So the best lower bound we get is not even linear. So there is an exponential gap between upper bound and lower bounds. Closing this gap is perhaps the most one of the most important problem in this area. So in today's invited talk, you're going to hear exciting progress in improving the upper bounds. Besides invited talks, although the situation for general schemes are really bad, we have important special cases which the situation is exponentially better. In particular, there's a subclass of general schemes called linear schemes. So for those schemes, we can prove exponential lower bounds. Then a natural question to ask is what happened in between? So we know a lot about linear schemes. For general schemes, like the lower bounds really bad, is there any way to brought ideas from linear to general schemes? Is there any notion in between them? So in the third talk of this section, you're going to hear about polynomial secret sharing schemes, try to bridge this gap. Another special case of general access structure is called social access structure. So usually, even the construction for general access structure is really bad, but we have very good construction for special cases. Is there any chance we can also define some intermediate notion, try to broad ideas from special cases, try to improve the general cases? So in the first talk, you're going to hear some approaches, try to bridge these two. So to sum up, the first collections is all about bridging gaps. So we have exponential gaps between different kinds of notion, upper and lower bounds, special case and general case. We try to define intermediate notions, try to gain understanding slowly. Hopefully we can get help to attack the difficult problems. Okay, so this is the first collection. Let me go with the second collection. So the second collection contains 2 talks. So the first talk is about non-malleable codes, and the second talk is about leakage resilient secret sharing. So the first thing you may want to ask, what does non-malleable codes and leakage resilient secret sharing have anything in common? Yes, actually, to define both of them, you need to carefully specify what's the adversary model. For non-malleable codes, you need to specify what is temporary model. For leakage resilient secret sharing, you need to specify what is leakage model. And interestingly, in both areas, there are a lot of intensively works about a model called local models. And more interestingly, now there's a trend to let's move from local to more global temporary models. For example, AC0, or more general linear low degree functions. So this section, I call them Go Global, which they try to design those primitives for global adversary models. Okay, let's go to the third collection of talks. So for the third collection of talks, I don't want to talk too much because it's very easy to spoil the talk. And so I want to just copy some comments from our discussion. So I label this collection as simple and neat. and you should like explore them by yourself. Hope you enjoy the talks. Okay.
All right, thank you very much, Siyao. I guess we are ready to start the talks. The first talk is demultiplicative secret sharing for multipartite adversary structures by Reo Eriguchi and Noboru Kunihiro. And Reo will give the talk.
Oh, well, thank you for your introduction. Today, I talk about a special class of secret sharing schemes called demultiplicative secret sharing. So first, I explain the definition of secret sharing. We assume that there are n players, and an adversary can corrupt a subset of players, and we define an adversary structure, delta, as a collection of such subsets. And then the delta has a monotone decreasing property. And we suppose that the domain of secrets is a finite field of size Q. And we let Si be the set of the ith shares. Then a secret sharing scheme is a randomized function whose input is a field element and output is a tuple of n shares. And then we call the secret sharing scheme a delta private if no information on a secret is revealed from any subset in delta. And we measure the efficiency of the secret sharing scheme by the total information ratio, which is defined by the ratio between the total size of n shares and the size of a secret. So it is important to minimize the information ratio to obtain efficient schemes. Now I provide the definition of demultiplicative secret sharing. A secret sharing scheme is called demultiplicative if there is a deterministic function mult for each player I. This function takes d shares as inputs, and if each share corresponds to the ith share of the secret Sj, then this function generates an additive sharing of the product of d secrets, S1 to Sd. And then, in other words, the players can locally compute an additive sharing of the product from their own shares. Now, demultiplicative secret sharing can be used to construct two-round and conditionally secure multi-party computation protocols for computing multivariate polynomials of total degree at most d. So I show a simple protocol for computing the product of d secrets. We suppose that each client has his secret input, Sj, and then each client shares his inputs among n servers by using demultiplicative schemes. And then each server can locally compute the function mult and obtain the additive sharing of the product. So finally, an output client collects these additive sharing and recovers the desired output. So now the communication complexity of this protocol is proportional to the information ratio and the bit length of the field size. And the protocol is passively secure against an adversary structure delta. So it is important to construct demultiplicative secret sharing such that information ratio and the field size are small, and it is delta private for a large adversary structure delta. Now, I briefly show the previously known results about demultiplicative secret sharing. First, as a negative result, delta private and demultiplicative secret sharing exists only if the adversary structure is of type QD. That is, no D subsets in delta can cover the whole set P. And on the other hand, for any adversary structure delta of type QD, it is possible to construct demultiplicative schemes for delta. But this scheme is very inefficient due to exponentially large information ratio. And if D is equal to 2, a more efficient construction based on linear schemes is known. And Shamir's scheme is also demultiplicative, but this scheme can deal with only threshold adversary structures. And finally, to reduce the field size of Shamir's scheme, demultiplicative schemes based on algebraic curves were devised. So if we choose an algebraic curve with many rational points, we can obtain demultiplicative schemes over smaller fields than the Shamir scheme. And now I explained our proposed secret sharing scheme. Our scheme can deal with multipartite adversary structures. So suppose that P is divided into L parts, P1 to PL, and we call a pi permutation if it maps every player in each part to the same part. Then an adversary structure is called pipartite if the image of every subset in delta by any pi permutation is also in delta. So informally, in a pipartite adversary structure, whether a subset X is in delta or not is uniquely determined by the associated vector defined like this. So now, for example, threshold adversary structures are one partite adversary structure with respect to this trivial partition. And then every adversary structure can be viewed as an n-partite adversary structure with respect to this partition. And now I show our main results. In this work, we propose two kinds of demultiplicative secret sharing for L-partite adversary structures. And the first scheme can be applied to any L-partite adversary structure of type QD. Because there are demultiplicative schemes only for QD adversary structures, so our scheme can deal with all the possible L-partite adversary structures. And this scheme has polynomial information ratio, or if L is constant. So our scheme is much more efficient than the generic construction. And more precisely, the information ratio is upper bounded by the size of this set of vectors, which consists of all the maximal vectors with respect to the coordinated order. And next, the second scheme can be applied to L-partite adversary structures satisfying this geometric condition. And this condition is a stronger assumption than type QD. So the second scheme can be applied to a smaller class of L-partite adversary structures than the first scheme. But this scheme has smaller information ratio than the first scheme if epsilon is not very small or constant, for example. And finally, I briefly remark on future work. Both of our schemes require the field size to be sufficiently large. So future work is the construction of demultiplicative secret sharing over smaller fields. This can reduce the communication complexity of the protocol. And another one is an extension of our proposed scheme to the verifiable demultiplicative schemes, which can detect the malicious behavior in the protocol. That's all. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. So we're going to leave any questions to the end, and we're going to proceed with the second talk. The second talk is leakage resilient secret sharing in non-compartmentalized models by Lin, Cheraghchi, Guruswamy, Safavi Naini, and Wang, and Fuchun Lin will present this work. If you can share your slides. Okay.
Okay, can I start?
Yes, go ahead.
So a simple example of secret sharing scheme. You divide the secret into several parts several shells. And if you have enough number of
just a
cells,
comment that there's the build order on top of your screen. Could you, there's this window, it sometimes pops up in Keynote. If you can close that window.
okay.
Yeah.
And I'll do it again.
All right.
So if you have enough number of cells, then you can recover the secret. Even with one cell less, then you have no information about the secret. And usually the privacy here is perfectly private, but also there are sometimes people consider statistical secret sharing. They use statistical distance to measure the amount of leakage. Siyao scheme is a threshold scheme. It can be interpreted as encoding a random message using an MDS code. And then you do the vector matrix multiplication to generate shells. It's easy to see that with enough number of cells, you can reconstruct the secret. In fact, you also reconstruct the randomness and the full shell vector. This is called full reconstruction in secret sharing scheme. And you can easily see that with one cell less, then the distribution of these T-1 cells are uniform, and it is independent of which secret you are encoding. Now the question is, what if the adversary can dig beyond this standard any arbitrary T-1 cells? For example, the so-called local leakage model. You can dig a few bits, about a number of bits from every shell. And there's a result from coding theory that says that if you have a Reed-Solomon code, which is basically secret Siyao scheme, and then if you have a component broken, then you can download 1 bit from each component to repair that component. And in secret sharing scheme, this means that we can download 1 bit from each shell and recover the secret. This says that this secret sharing scheme is completely not leakage resilient with respect to local leakage. But on the other hand, there's a result saying that if this Siyao scheme, the underlying finite field is large prime, then it is actually leakage resilient with respect to local leakage model. That means the adversary can apply arbitrary leakage function independently to each shell and leak a bounded number of bits. And of course, here you cannot hope to have perfect privacy or a perfect leakage resilience. You have to tolerate epsilon measured by statistical distance. So we can see that if the adversary is stronger than the standard model, then Siyao scheme itself is not enough. And later people consider even more stronger than local leakage. They consider joint leakage, and they also consider adaptive leakage, and they need more and more complicated techniques to construct the leakage resilient secret sharing scheme. So in this work, we look at a global leakage model. We are allowing the adversary to access all the shelves at the same time. And since we are allowing the adversary to have access to all the shelves, we have to restrict the leakage function that are allowed for the adversary. Otherwise, the adversary can simply use the reconstruction algorithm and reconstruct the secret and output only one bit. So we restrict the adversary to some structured class of leakage functions. And the adversary can choose arbitrary function from that class. The adversary can, as in the standard model, ask for several a bounded number of full shelves.
What?
If the adversary commits to the queries before the game, then this adversary is called long-adaptive. We also consider adaptive adversary. For example, the adversary can first apply a global leakage function, leak some number of bits, and according to these results, we make the choice of the full shelves and continue in this adaptive fashion. Okay, this is our technique. So we have just seen that Shamir scheme is not enough for fancy leakage. And what we do is we use a randomness extractor to mix up the secret and the randomness before we input into the Shamir scheme. Since we are using a randomness extractor, we first assume that the secret has a uniform distribution. And if we input the uniform secret together with the randomness into the inverter of an extractor, we get a uniform preimage. And then we interpret this uniform preimage as T finite field elements and do the Shamir scheme. Now suppose an adversary apply a leakage function and obtain the leakage conditions on this leakage, the distribution of a uniform preimage becomes non-uniform. But if your extractor can extract uniform distribution out of that distribution, then you recover the uniform secret. So in this sense, you see that the secret and the leakage are independent. And that means leakage precedent. So we use this idea and give 4 example constructions for different leakage adversaries. For example, if the adversary is an affine adversary, it can only apply degree 1 leakage function. Then we use affine extractor. If it is a degree D polynomial, then we use the corresponding algebraic extractor. And when the adversary is long-adaptive or partially adaptive, we also can use seeded extractor. Here are some more details. So the kind of extractor we required, firstly, it has to be invertible, since we are using the inverter to do the Siyao algorithm. For example, if the extractor function itself is a linear function, then it is efficiently invertible. In the case of linear seeded extractor, it is. And we want the extractor to be able to extract from any constant fraction of entropy. This is because we have a uniform preimage that's about the amount of T finite field elements. And we allow the adversary to leak T-1 finite field elements. So we only have 1/T fraction of entropy left if we want to have a threshold scheme. And of course, we want the extractor to be able to extract all the randomness. In that case, we will have we can extract all the amount of remaining entropy is one finite field element. If we can extract all the randomness, then the secret length is equal to the cell length. This is just as good as the Siyao scheme. Usually, you can only extract all the randomness using a seeded extractor. And in that case, we need to also include the seed. And then we then need the seed to be of negligible length. And finally, we want to have very small extractor error. Since the extractor error is not equal to the leakage resilient error, there is a blow up. And if we don't have small extractor error, we can get annoyed using some special structure. For example, if your extractor is linear and your leakage function is affine, basically you have an affine source, affine distribution. When you apply a linear function to an affine distribution, you get an affine distribution. And affine distribution is equal to uniform if the dimension is equal to the universe. Otherwise, it's going to be at least one dimension less than the universe. Then the statistical distance is going to be very bad. In this case, you can get a stronger result that says that for most of the cases, you get extractor error 0, and only for a negligible fraction, you get a big extractor error. And then in that case, the extractor error becomes equal to the leakage resilient error. So putting all these nice properties together, for the long-adaptive adversary and affine leakage, we get a leakage resilient version of Siyao scheme. The secret length is equal to the cell length, and you can tolerate whatever leakage, the affine leakage, and together with the full cell leakage, as long as the total amount of information given to the adversary is at most T-1 cell in size. Okay, I will stop here.
All right, thank you very much. The next talk is on polynomial secret sharing schemes by Paskin, Chernyavsky, and Radun, and Anat will give the talk.
Good, so sharing the slides. Yeah. Just a second. Okay, seems to be working. Okay, thank you for the introduction. I'm happy to present our work here at the first ITC, and I'll talk about polynomial secret sharing schemes. So let's have a quick recap of what a secret sharing scheme is. So a secret sharing scheme allows a dealer to share a secret among some n parties according to some access structure. That is, sets of parties that are qualified according to that access structure will learn the secrets, while sets which are not qualified will learn nothing about the secret. So that setting was introduced by Shamir and Blakely in the late 70s, and for the threshold case, and generalized for general monotone access structures a few years later. And we focus on the perfect, okay, just also let me mention that general secret sharing schemes in this talk, the most general setting is one where the randomness is sampled uniformly from that finite domain R. Now we will focus on perfect secret sharing, where every authorized set recovers the secret with probability 1, while unauthorized sets see shared distributions which are independent of the secret, completely independent. Now, a very useful type of secret sharing schemes are linear secret sharing schemes, where the secret domain is some finite field, and the randomness is some vector over the same finite field of some fixed length, and the shares are comprised of multilinear polynomials in this secret and randomness elements. Now, this type of schemes is very popular. Most schemes constructed so far are linear, both because it has nice structures that are useful for many applications like MPC, and also its relative simplicity is kind of conceptually nice for designing schemes. And let me mention that schemes with polynomial share complexity only correspond to X structures which are in NC. So what is share complexity? So recall the share complexity is arguably the most important complexity measure of secret sharing schemes, is simply the total length of shares obtained by all parties in bits in the worst case. And sometimes we're also interested in the information rate, which is the share complexity normalized by the secret length. And we have a huge gap between the best constructions for the worst X structures known, which are exponential, and the best known lower bounds, which are not even quadratic. And the latter is in spite of some quite exciting recent advances on the upper bound front. Now, note that this lower bound hasn't changed for over 25 years. On the other hand, for linear, as Siyao mentioned in the intro, schemes were doing much better. So the upper bound is best known is still exponential, but the lower bounds are also exponential. So there's still some gap, but it's much, much better. Also, let me mention that for a fixed constant field size, it is easy to obtain exponential lower bounds just by counting for certain X structures, while the more recent results, including this recent preprint, are stronger in the sense that they apply to all fields. On the other hand, for general schemes, even counting-based approaches don't work. So we don't have any better existential results even. Okay, and the multilinear scheme generalizes linear schemes, allowing the secret to also be a vector rather than a single field element. So these schemes have also been studied somewhat broadly, but somewhat less, and their advantage is that they may help us improve the information rate. And indeed, there is some recent evidence that this is possible. And here, on the lower bound front, we are doing much better than in the general setting, but still worse than for linear schemes. So in this work, we introduce a natural generalization of multilinear schemes to which we call polynomial secret sharing schemes, where we simply allow the polynomials appearing in the various shares to have any degree, not just degree 1. And our main motivation is that the hope that we can obtain better than general lower bounds for this broader class generalizing multilinear. And it's a good starting point is considering degree 2 polynomials. And in the long run, hopefully, this could help us make inroads into into lower bounds on general secret sharing schemes, especially as polynomial schemes are very expressive, and essentially, at least in the statistical setting, they're as general as you can get, basically. So let me quickly mention some results. So on the share complexity front, we have some negative results. The first result saying that degree 1 in R almost all of these schemes, some large subset of such schemes, are actually as powerful as multilinear schemes, in the sense that any such scheme has an equivalent multilinear scheme with almost the same share complexity, maybe with some overhead n, and over the same field. And for degree 2, we show that linear terms in R must be present, or else, even regardless of share complexity, one can only implement some very simple access structures. Another aspect to consider is the randomness complexity. So let me try to convince you that it is important. So for multilinear schemes, without loss of generality, the randomness complexity is upper bounded by share complexity. That is, you can reduce the randomness complexity that much without losing on share complexity. For degree 2, for instance, nothing like that is known. And if we had such a bound, even a much worse bound than this one, this would imply a counting-based lower bound on share complexity, which is already better than for general schemes. And there are also additional nice applications that for upper bounding the randomness complexity that I will not mention here. So we have made some progress on this front. So for quadratic schemes, we've shown that any such scheme has an equivalent scheme with the same share complexity and randomness complexity, which is exponential in the share complexity. The exponent is not very horrible here, but still it's not good enough for implying good lower bounds on share complexity. And for general schemes, we also obtain a similar bound. And let me mention that our proof also implies a similar bound for completely general perfect secret sharing schemes. And while such a bound is quite trivial for statistical bound schemes, we can even get a better bound, but as far as we know, it was not known for perfect ID and finally, so correct me if I'm wrong. And finally, let me just mention that there is a lot of future work and interesting open questions like the randomness complexity, for instance, and many more. And you're welcome to take a look at the longer slides or the paper. Thank you for your attention.
All right, thank you very much for the talk. If there are any questions during the talk, you can just post on Q&A or the chat, and in the end of the session, we go over them and ask the speakers. So let's proceed with the fourth talk, which is on locally decodable codes in resource-bounded channels by Jeremiah Blocky, Shubhang Kulkarni, and Samsung Zhu. And Shubhang will present the work.
I think the screen has to be stopped sharing.
Yeah,
I didn't stop. Okay, sorry.
All right, cool.
Yeah.
Okay. So thank you for the introduction, and hope everyone enjoys the talk. So our story begins with the need for reliable communication. Let's take a look at this Mars mission, whose goal is to confirm the presence of water. Knowing that space is noisy, we should add some sort of redundancy to our message so that when space corrupts the transmission, Earth can recover it as intended, in this case, by a simple majority vote. You may notice, however, that reading the entire transmission and recovering the entire message is quite unnecessary for Earth in this case. In particular, it suffices for Earth to just recover the first Y symbol, and it can do so by making just 3 local queries to the transmission and taking a majority vote. So this is the setting that we'll be interested in. And let's abstract away the details and establish a simple model. So sender and receiver are communicating over a noisy channel. To combat the noise, the communicating parties encode and decode the message. We're interested in the setting where the receiver wants to decode a specific, say the ith symbol of the initial message. And for this, the decoder gets query or oracle access to the corrupted code word. Now, the goal of the communicating parties is to design codes for reliable communication, which we take to be recovering the ith bit with, say, good probability. At the same time, we hope to minimize the communication cost, which for us just means low code word length and a small number of decoder queries to the code word. And finally, we also want to maximize the communication robustness, which we're going to take to be tolerating a large number of errors from the noisy channel. So let's take a look at the channel. And actually, modeling the noisy channel is crucial for the design of good codes. And historically, they've been modeled as two broad categories: Shannon channels and Hamming channels. So Shannon channels are purely probabilistic and flip each bit of the code word independently at random. On the other hand, Hamming channels are adversarial and introduce worst case error patterns into the code word, subject to some upper bounds on the number of errors. Both of these have their pros and cons. So Shannon channels admit good LDCs with very good properties, but these error patterns don't capture scenarios such as, say, burst errors in nature very well. On the other hand, since Hamming channels are worst case, constructions for Hamming channels have broad application. However, there are no known good LDCs with good parameter trade-offs in Hamming channels. So for the purposes of this talk, good properties is going to mean constant rate, polylog locality, and constant error rate. So you may observe that these models seem to be opposite extremes, and our work begins by asking the question of what are practically motivated channels admitting good LDCs? So let's go back to our Mars example. While sending messages back to Earth, our spacecraft is actually beaming the transmission using electromagnetic waves. And so a few practical observations are that the maximum Earth-Mars distance, as well as the speed of light, are upper bounded. And we can immediately conclude using these bounds that space has a bounded amount of time within which it has to corrupt the message. In fact, we can calculate this bound to be approximately 22 minutes by plugging in our observations. And so the point is that space isn't an unbounded adversary, and so assuming so is overly pessimistic, which leaves us with the natural question of whether including this time bound in our channel model would be beneficial for LDC constructions. And our work answers this question with a yes, but in the parallel oracle model. This is an idealized setting where cryptographic hash functions such as SHA-3 is modeled as a purely black box function. Of course, we aren't limited to just time bounds, and we can consider any resource bounds. So how do we do this? Our first technical tool will be private LDCs. So these are LDCs defined in the setting where the communicating parties have shared secret keys, so the channel does not know these keys. Ostrovsky, Pandey, and Sahai showed constructions of private LDCs with good properties under our notion of goodness. Note that in our setting, the communicating parties don't possess shared keys. So if we were to use these constructions, the encoder would need to find a way to securely signal a key to the local decoder. Our second and final tool will be that of a safe function, and we're going to use safe functions to solve our previous problem. Intuitively, a function is safe against a channel if the channel cannot predict the value of the function given the input. In slightly more formal terms, it can predict the value of the function with probability at most delta. So a few intuitive examples are that hash iteration is safe against sequential time-bounded channels. And memory hard functions such as scrypt are safe against space time-bounded channels. In our main paper, we formalize various resources and discuss various safe function constructions for these resources. And I refer you to the main paper for this. So let's put everything together and take a look at the LDC framework that bootstraps private LDCs. So given an input message, the encoder first randomly samples a small seed and extracts a secret key using the safe function of the channel. This is done in the parallel random oracle model. The extracted key can then be used in conjunction with the private LDC encoder to encode the message. Finally, an encoding of the seed is appended to the message encoding, and the entire encoding is sent over the channel. The local decoder is going to get query access to the corrupted version of this encoding, along with the index to decode, which is shown in red. It first decodes the seed and extracts the same key via the safe function. Finally, it uses the private LDC decoder to get the original intended symbol. Of course, this is a very high-level overview of the framework, and I would encourage you to look at the main paper for details. So recall the private LDC constructions of Ostrovsky et al. Had our target good properties. And in our main paper, we show how to encode the seed so that it can be locally decoded. And our final framework is able to inherit the good properties from private LDCs with small loss. In particular, we get polylog locality, constant rate, constant error rate, and high probability of decoding. And so in conclusion, resource-bounded channels better capture realistic error patterns that occur in nature, and we can actually construct efficient LDCs for these types of channels. We can do so by using safe functions to extract private shared keys between the communicating parties, and these can be used to bootstrap off of private LDC constructions. Our work leads to a few interesting open questions of what are other applications of these safe functions that we've defined, and also whether there are LDCs for resource-bounded channels without random oracles. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. The last talk of the session is Expander Graphs on Non-Malleable Codes by Rasmussen and Sahai, and Peter will give the talk.
Yep. All right. Wait, is my screen shared yet? Okay.
Not
wait.
yet.
No.
Why is it not shared? Oh, right. Okay, wait, now I got it. Let's see. Okay, like this. How's that?
Perfect.
Okay, great. Let me just like this. All right. Hi everyone. I'm Peter, as mentioned, this is joint work with Amit Sahai. Title of the paper is Expander Graphs are Non-Malleable Codes, and we're lucky enough that this is in fact also basically the main theorem of the paper. So, right, the main theorem, let's jump right into it. It says that if you have a deregular graph on n vertices, and you have sufficiently many vertices, and this is a sufficiently good expander graph, then you have a good non-malleable code for single bit messages in the split state model. And okay, so we'll start off by unpacking what a non-malleable code is, and what the split state model is, and then I hope you'll understand what this means. Right, so first, codes, as we just had described, we want to send some message across a channel controlled by an adversary. And to do so, we take the message, we encode it, and then we allow the adversary to apply some tampering function f to the encoded message, and then we hope that the message survives in some way. So in this model, we have, at least the one I'll describe, we have two dials. We have basically, we can ask, what do we mean that we preserve integrity of this message? And the other is, what functions do we allow the adversary to apply? And this is an information theoretical questions. The encoding and decoding functions are publicly available and as such. Anyway, let's move on. So just to give an example of this, for error correcting codes, typically the class of functions f that the adversary can choose from can only change, any function from that can only change some fraction of the bits of the encoded message. And in this case, we get a lot of nice stuff. We get great rates. We actually are just simply able to preserve the entire message. But suppose we had a stronger adversary that, for instance, were allowed to switch out the entire code word, then we can't hope for as much. So this is what Zembowski, Pietzak, and Wicks set out to investigate in 2010, and they defined non-malleable codes. So non-malleability is trying to capture these stronger adversaries, and with non-malleability, what we're trying is that there should be no meaningful tampering of the message from start to finish. And to define meaningful tampering, let's instead define what do we consider trivial tampering. So if the adversary simply copies the message, we consider that pretty trivial. If they change it to some constant message unrelated to the starting message, or if they change it to some nonsensical message that's just, yeah, they just scramble the message, then we just also consider that trivial. So for instance, you can't say, if we had encoded an integer, you can't say m+1. Like this we shouldn't allow. And essentially the model is that it's a non-malleable code if with very low probability, the adversary can do anything beyond this. Right. So this is a very short talk, so this will be the description we'll use. Right, so for the split state model, so this is what functions the adversary are allowed to apply. So the model is the following. You encode a message M by encoding it into two separate code words. And then you allow the adversary to apply any function to the left code word and any function to the right code word. And then you decode. And so this is the model that you want to defend against. And this took a while to do anything about. So this was defined in 2010, as I mentioned, and then it took until 2013 for Zembowski, Kasana, and Obrimsky to come up with a construction for just a 1-bit non-malleable code in this split state setting. And after that, a lot of great work was done inspired by this. And almost all of it based on this idea of using two-source extractors. And this has led to some excellent non-malleable codes. You can get really good rates. You can encode messages of any length. And so this is not what we improve in the paper at hand. We're going in an opposite direction. We're trying, could we construct non-malleable codes from something else? And then our result is that you can actually just use expanders instead of two-source extractors. And that this gives a much simpler proof than the existing ones, or at least more elementary. And now I guess the obvious thing to consider is, well, two-source extractors and expanders are related in some way. But first of all, expanders have been around for a really long time. They're very simple to define. Most two-source extractors are expanders, but maybe not so much the other way around. And so the idea is that, well, or our result is that something as simple as expanders actually lead to non-malleable codes. Right. And so now, an obvious question is, how do you actually get a code from a graph? And the construction is inspired by the original paper by Zembowski et al. You take your graph and then you encode a message as a bit as two vertices of the graph. And then you say that you've encoded a 1 if there's an edge between the two vertices and a 0 otherwise. And you simply encode by just uniformly sampling given this. And then if this is your code, if this is the code you get from a graph, then the result is that if you have a sufficiently large graph with sufficiently good expansion, then this is a 1-bit non-malleable code in the split state model for single-bit messages. So what could we hope to do with this? Well, first of all, it's, at least I think, so interesting in its own right. But then the idea or the hope would be that we could further, just like the Zimbowski et al. Paper started basically non-malleable codes on two-source extractors, that we could do something similar with expanders. To do that, we would need to be able to encode longer messages, add leakage, for instance. And the hope would then be that we would be able to get simpler non-malleable codes with more elementary proofs, with more elementary methods. And perhaps that this would lead to some deeper understanding of non-malleable codes. Right, thanks for listening in.
All right, thank you very much. So this concludes the 5 talks of the session. Now we have a lot of time for questions, and already we have a few on the chat. So let's start with the ones for Peter, because he's already talking. So I see that there's a question: is there evidence that there is no hidden extractor structure in the graph approach? So just to add to that, is there a connection between extractors, two-source extractors and expanders that might be exploited to extend your results, to or provide connections with the extractor-based approach?
Right. So first of all, I should mention that I'm in no way an expert on extractors, but it's my impression that there is, how can I say this? Sorry, I'm just rereading the question. I'm not sure whether there is some hidden extractor structure, and I'm not aware of any extractor constructions directly from expanders, but I might be wrong. I guess the one way to look at this problem, just preempting another question that I can see here on the screen, is that you can just view one of these one-bit non-malleable codes as a graph, right? Like you can see all possible, at least if the left and the right messages have the same codomain or same range, then you can just put an edge between all pairs that encode a 1, right? And then you get a graph, and the question is then how do you make up a graph that is a non-malleable code? And one way to do this is, as Zimbowski et al. Did it, to use a two-source extractor to construct this graph. Another way is just to ask, so what is what property of the graph would be sufficient? And here it turns out that that expansion is sufficient.
Thank you. There's a related question in Q&A by Joao, who asks, which properties do you need from your graph to get explicit non-malleable codes? So I guess what's the necessary requirement that you're using?
So in the, I'm not entirely sure what that means, but in the proof, we just use that the graph satisfies the expander mixing lemma. And since this is equivalent with the spectral expansion, I think like any graph satisfying mixing lemma also is an expander. So I think basically that is all. Right.
I see. Another one is, do you also need randomization for the construction of non-malleable codes from expander graphs?
No, you can
Yeah.
use explicit constructions. So details are in the paper, but there are some very nice constructions of expander graphs that you can just plug and play. And also one thing here is that you you don't you're not required to have very low degree, which is usually what you want in expander graphs. Actually, you want to have high degree. And with high degree, it's very easy to construct very good expanders.
Okay, great. In the chat window, I see, in general, can we consider K coloring the complete graph and use that to encode K messages rather than 2 messages?
Yes, this is an excellent question, and one that I've been thinking about for quite a while. This is one approach that could possibly yield constructions for longer messages. And again, you can just view the entire question as exactly this, right? Like if you have a non-malleable code, you could just color the edges accordingly, and then you just ask, like, what does this graph need to satisfy? But I don't know what this graph needs to satisfy. So maybe we'll find out someday.
Okay, great. So there are more questions about other talks. I think for the fourth talk by Shubhang, there's a question by Adam. Why do you need the seed to be locally decodable? Is F based on only a subset of constructions? Also, what specific classes of channels do the constructions work for? I see already Shubhang gave an answer, so maybe you could expand on that, and so that we can all hear.
Yeah, sure. So the seed has to be locally decodable in the sense it's locally decodable with respect to the entire code word. So the seed is actually used to extract the secret key. And so the seed length has to be large enough because the security of our entire protocol is going to be based on the seed length. But since the entire seed has to be decoded, we're going to have to encode it with a error correcting code. And specifically, so we can instantiate it by encoding it with, say, like a repetition code concatenated with a justice encode. But so since the entire seed has to be decoded, we also have the goal of minimizing locality. So the seed length also has to be chosen sufficiently small enough to maintain locality. And so considering all these trade-offs is what I meant by the seed to be locally decodable. So as to maintain the overall locality of polylog, as I mentioned as the parameters that we get. Specific classes of channels that we consider.
On the question.
Yeah.
Sorry. Just to follow up on that. So does the fact that your seed ends up having to be really short, and thus the pre-image to the seed has to be the pre-image to F has to be short, right, for it to be decodable without expanding the errors too much. And so how does that connect with, like, can't the channel just corrupt those positions and ensure that the seed is not properly received?
Right, but you can also, that's where the error correcting code kicks in. So for example, if you repeat the seed a bunch of times, even though it's small, and then say sample a few of those seeds and take a majority vote.
I see, so its encoding doesn't have to occupy a negligible fraction of the...
Yeah, so in our case, it actually captures a half of the entire code word, but you can...
I see. So that limits.
You can probably optimize that. Yeah.
Rate you could tolerate.
Correct.
So you're not getting close to like existing bounds for.
So we have some. So obviously we're going to inherit the rate from the private LDCs, and we have some small loss from that because of our seed encoding.
I see. Okay, got it.
or factor 2 loss. Yeah. And,
Shubhang, I'm wondering, what are the known locally decodable codes for the Shannon model that don't work for Hamming?
So if you look at the Ostrovsky et al. Construction and just take away the private keys, then what you're left with, you'd get as locally decodable code for the Shannon channel. Because what the private keys do is it basically makes the adversarial channel behave as a Shannon channel. So they bootstrap off of Shannon channel codes. So you can just like block your code into small blocks and encode each block using some constant rate code. And that would be, and then whenever you want to decode a specific index, you just decode that particular block having small length.
I see. Does it matter what the underlying code is that you use as a building block, or could it be any good code?
So we inherit that from private LDCs, and for them, they can use any constant rate code. So that should be fine.
Another question I wanted to ask is the safe functions that you use, do you provide new constructions for various models, or do you use the memory hard functions and so on for specific models that were known before?
Yeah, we provide a few graph labeling functions, so essentially we define this notion of safe functions, and then we show how to instantiate them for specific resource bounds. But the framework works for any channel that has a safe function. But yeah, we do give some constructions, if that was your question.
So if I have my favorite channel and a safe function for that, I can plug in your construction.
Yeah, correct. But note that this is in the random oracle model, and open question is whether this can be done without random oracles.
Okay. I think another question on chat is related to, is for Anat. That says, it's my Mahdi, what is the simplest access structure measured by their complexity class that witnesses an exponential gap in the positive and negative result? So I guess what it means is what kind of access structures whether the lower bounds that we know, what is the gap for them with their corresponding upper bounds, if I understand it right. Could you unmute yourself?
Right. Yeah. So if I understand the question correctly, then for general schemes, the upper bounds are basically generic constructions that just work for all access structures. So right, there are no like particular witnesses which we know we do worst, as far as I know. Now for the lower bound, again, for the general one, there is a particular construction of the of some scheme. We can like Xirmaz proved that that we can do that bad. And actually, what in the context of our work, maybe let me add that the Xirmaz's approach is based on information theory. Kind of entropy considerations, etc., and hopefully with our approach, like taking advantage of the more algebraic structure, let's say of degree 2 polynomials or whatever, we can somewhat improve this lower bound and give an example of another access structure, which is say a particular one which requires somewhat higher complexity, right? So share complexity. That is provable. And also in terms of counting, if we can have a good upper bound on the randomness complexity, then we can have actually a non-specific example, like we can have an existential bound saying there exists some scheme that doesn't have, say, the good degree to some access structure that doesn't have a good degree to scheme.
Okay, so with the counting argument for the linear schemes, if you, so I guess it easily gives 2 to the omega of n, but what is the constant behind? Is it 2 to the n over 2 or?
So if I remember correctly, like it's easy to compute. I think it's 2 to the n over 2. Like it's quite easy to do the calculation, but that's for fixed like constant fields. And the stronger bounds are for any fields from other works which are not like simple counting based. And for say degree 2, we don't have that because we don't have any like good enough upper bounds on the randomness complexity. So it could be huge, and then small like in this randomness is still possibly too large to be non-trivial.
Is there a consensus whether 2 to the n over 2 might be the right bound for general access structures?
So I'm not sure. I've seen a recent work on right? Maybe Amos can answer. Can give a better answer because I was going to mention one of his recent works.
Okay.
For linear schemes, with span sequence, as Anat said, the low bound is 2 to the n over 2. The upper bound is 2 to the 0.76 n. I would conjecture, and I have famous conjectures that might not be true, that n over 2 is the right thing for linear schemes.
Okay, yeah. I see Vinod is smiling. But
I have no.
Okay, yeah, great.
I have no evidence why this is true for other classes of secret sharing scheme. What we get from the simple counting arguments turn out that the lower bounds are tight, and we find the lower bounds for counting is simple, and we get the upper bounds. But I would conjecture that 2 to the n over 2 plus O of little o of 1 is a tight one, but and it should.
Awesome.
And it might be possible to obtain it not with complicated more complicated tools than we have now.
And can it be obtained by linear schemes, you think?
I would say that by linear schemes. For
okay.
linear, I have no way. I don't know what share size is.
Okay, so we have that recorded now. Another question, I think it's for Shubhang. Is there a connection between safe functions and one-way functions?
So the definitions are quite similar, but I haven't explored the connections per se. So I can definitely talk about it offline if anyone's interested.
Okay, it seems like we have more votes for 2 to the n over 2. Very popular bound. Another question I see is from Adam. If you have time and don't have questions for Shubhang, is there a connection to recent work by Shaltiel and co-authors on regular error correcting codes for space-bounded channels? They hide the locations that encode the seed, which means that they do not lose rate relative to the secret key construction. Shubhang already said I'm unfamiliar.
Yeah, so I'm kind of unfamiliar with that work, but definitely looking it up right now. So
okay, yeah.
I'd love to talk to Adam offline.
Yeah, that definitely seems relevant. Okay. It seems like the time is up and we have to take the break. Thanks everyone for the great session. We can continue the voting on 2 to the number 2 offline. And yeah, see you after.
Okay, so we resume at 10:30 Eastern Daylight Time.